Good day, everyone. So before we formally start this session, I would like to know how are my students? So are you feeling good or are you feeling excited? Kindly raise your hand if you are happy. Just kidding. Anyway, if you are feeling good, I hope that we continue that way along with this online class journey. Moving on, we all know that facilitation will not be completed without having an activity beforehand. With that, I presume that as you are learning with me right now, you have already participated those activities and answered the analysis part for today's session. Now, let's proceed to our learning objectives. So at the end of this session, you are expected to define the learner-centered psychological principles pertaining to the learner and learning process, modify the psychological principles based on its varied factors, integrate the psychological factors as a complement to the holistic development of learners. And lastly, demonstrate the psychological principles in a real-world situations. In order to achieve these objectives, I, together with my group mates, Del Rosario, Haitosis, and Amora, will be facilitating you for today's session regarding learner-centered psychological principles, respectively. This is to help you understand how this subject matter best fits to your distinctive nature of learning, since it provides a framework from the best available knowledge about learning and how it occurs, as well as about teaching practices that are most effective in promoting the highest levels of motivation, learning, and achievement for all learners, which can overall contribute to current educational reform and school redesign efforts. These principles comprise not only systematically researched and progressively learner-centered that leads to effective schooling, but also principles that leads you, our teacher, and the systems that serve us to a lifelong learning, positive mental health, and productivity. As your first facilitator, let us first define what these principles are for. These learner-centered psychological principles actually pertain to the learner and the learning process. It focuses on psychological factors that are primarily internal to and under the control of the learner, rather than the conditioned habits like the result of reinforcements and physiological factors such as unbalanced nutrition and dehydration. However, the principles also attempt to acknowledge external environment or contextual factors that interact with these internal factors. Moreover, the principles are intended to deal holistically with learners in the context of real-world learning situations. Thus, they are best understood as an organized set of principles and that no principle should be viewed in isolation. The 14 principles are divided into those referring to cognitive and metacognitive, motivational and affective, developmental and social, and individual difference factors influencing learners and learning. Finally, the principles are intended to apply to all learners from children to teachers, to administrators, to parents, and to community members involved in our educational system. For the cognitive and metacognitive factors, we have here the nature of the learning process. Actually, there are different types of learning processes. For example, habit formation in motor learning. This is an automatized movement of students wherein the actions no longer require as much conscious thought and effort like that of those dancers. The other type of learning processes is the learning that involves the generation of knowledge or cognitive skills such as remembering what you memorize or perhaps a spontaneous critical thinking about a certain situation. Of course, the last but not the least is the learning strategies. These strategies may depend on the learning styles and preferences of students. When you say learning styles, these are the indicators of how learners perceive, interact with, and respond to the learning environment, which are overall influenced by nature or nurture. An example of these learning styles are visual learners, auditory learners, kinesthetic learners, and many others. Now, how could these learning styles contribute to the learning strategies of students? If the student learns best through listening, which makes that student an auditory learner, the learning strategy that student may have is reading the material or any kind of paper aloud and doing it alone without distracting others. However, take note that the learning strategy does not only revolve in this idea. The most common strategy among students is the spaced practice, wherein the studying has to take place in smaller chunks over time. To summarize, learning in schools emphasizes the use of intentional processes that students can use, intentional in a sense that students actually prefer to do, to construct meaning from information, experiences, and even their own thoughts and beliefs. According to this first principle, successful learners are active, goal-directed, self-regulating, and assume personal responsibility for contributing to their own learning, which leads that all principles focus on this type of learning. For the next principle, we have here the goals of the learning process. Based on this principle, the strategic nature of learning requires students to be goal-directed. Do you know that the key to be a successful learner is to be goal-directed? Yes, you all know this idea, but you are not that aware of on what extent this goal-directed brings you to. Hence, it is advisable to generate and pursue personally relevant goals to construct useful representations of knowledge and to acquire the thinking and learning strategies necessary for continued learning success across the lifespan. Initially, students' short-term goals and learning may be sketchy in an area, but over time their understanding can be refined by filling gaps, resolving inconsistencies, and deepening their understanding of the subject matter so that they can reach longer-term goals. Now, what are the examples of these short-term goals? You could start by aiming for a higher score, not in a sense of competing with others, but in improving yourself to a better version you could transform. These short-term goals will make you have informed decisions that will benefit you along the way, so it's just prudent that you set them. Now, how about the long-term goals? This could be an aim for at least having a 3.0 GPA upon graduation. Thus, short-term and long-term goals go hand in hand. Educators, on the other hand, can assist learners in creating meaningful learning goals that are consistent with both personal and educational aspirations and interests. According to this principle, successful learner over time and support over time and with support and instructional guidance can create meaningful and coherent representations of knowledge. For the third principle, we have here the construction of knowledge. As we all know, knowledge widens and deepens as students continue to build links between new information and experiences and their existing knowledge base. The nature of these links can take a variety of forms such as adding to, modifying, or reorganizing existing knowledge or skills. How these links are made or developed may vary in different subject areas and among students with varying talents, interests, and abilities. For instance, way back in our kindergarten years, the math teacher would always teach us to find the unknown number denoted as blank from a given addend with its corresponding sum. Usually, the technique that we use is to subtract the addend from the sum to get the other addend, that is the unknown one. Meanwhile, as we enter high school, the basic algebra is then introduced like x plus 7 equals 12. That's when we realize that the x there is the unknown number or perhaps the symbol blank to show that the other addend is missing or simply not given. This is how the construction of knowledge comes in. Your new knowledge will be linked to your prior knowledge depending on what extent you have understood in that subject matter, and most especially when your talents, interests, and abilities are involved. However, this new knowledge remains isolated and cannot be used most effectively in new tasks and does not transfer readily to new situations unless it becomes integrated with the learner's prior knowledge and understanding. Thus, educators can assist learners in acquiring and integrating knowledge by a number of strategies that I have been discussed before to be effective with learners of varying abilities. According to this principle, the successful learner can link new information with existing knowledge in meaningful ways. For the fourth one, we have here the strategic thinking. Based on this principle, successful learners use strategic thinking in their approach to learning, reasoning, problem solving, and concept learning. They understand and can use a variety of strategies to help them reach learning and performance goals and to apply their knowledge in novel situations. They also continue to expand their repertoire of strategies by reflecting on the methods they use to see which work well for them, by receiving guided instruction and feedback, and by observing or interacting with appropriate models. Learning outcomes can be enhanced if educators assist learners in developing, applying, and assessing their strategic learning skills. Okay, so that concludes my report. I hope that you have gained a bunch of knowledge after listening to this presentation. The remaining two principles from these cognitive and metacognitive factors will be facilitated by Mr. Del Rosario. Meanwhile, the other facilitators will also make you discover more about learner-centered psychological principles, so please stay tuned and enjoy learning.